Today I got a present from our neighbor. Let's have a look what's inside. Wow, what happened here? How does the paint get in the tube? And how long does it last? Hallo Rosada.
Hello Jürgen.
Hi, can you help me?
Of course.
I have some questions. Can you tell me if oil paint always has been in tubes?
That's a good question. Actually, paint tubes that we've come to know are a fairly modern invention. They were invented in 1841. Exactly. And before all of that time, of course, people still used oil paint, but they had to grind their own pigments. Pigments come in pulverized form, such as this, and painters of the past had to prepare their own paint every time they wanted to start working. Of course, more renowned and wealthy painters like Rembrandt wouldn't do it themselves, and they had many young apprentices, basically their pupils, whose chores that would be every day to grind the needed pigments for their master.
I see.
And of course, the invention of the tube also impacted the art world quite a lot, because it led to the Impressionist movement, as before the paint tube, people couldn't really take their oils outside to paint in nature from life. The only way to transport their paints was pig bladder, which you can imagine is an imperfect method of transportation. They would have to puncture the pig bladder and squeeze out the paint every time they wanted to use it, and then mend the hole, which of course quite often led to the paint drying out prematurely. So that's it in the nutshell.
Thank you. Rosada, what are you doing now?
I am preparing to make some paint. I'll be using this pigment, cobalt blue, to make some oil paint for myself.
Oh, can I help you?
Yes, of course. Well, first let me tell you a little bit about the process and what we'll be using. The most important instruments that we need for modeling paint is this glass slab that we use to actually grind the particles.
Okay, it's very heavy.
And we are also, the whole process happens on the glass slab, that allows us to ensure that the particles are actually not staying at the surface where we're grinding, but are mixing with each other. Then, the pigment that we'll be using today is cobalt blue, this beautiful blue shade. And, of course, as you were asking, the tube, This is where we're going to put our final product.
Okay.
The binding material for our pigment is linseed oil, the same thing that we use for painting. And finally, just some palette knives to help us work the pigment in the beginning stages.
Okay.
So first we want to put a little pile of the dry pigment in the middle of the slab.
Okay.
You don't want to put too much because we'll be working with small amounts at a time. It will make the mulling process much easier for us. So then in this pile, form a little crater in the middle. So now into this little crater, we'll be putting in some linseed oil. So important to start with much less than you think you need to add. The reason why is it will take some time for the pigment particles, for the dry pigment, to absorb the linseed oil. And once we start mulling it, we'll see how wet and runny the paint will actually become. But in the beginning, it looks quite dry and awkward, and that's normal.
You bake a bread?
Yeah, that's kind of similar to making dough. Yeah, so you want to just use your palette knife to work in together the pigment and the oil, adding just a few drops of oil at the time. So you want to get to consistency of somewhat dry peanut butter before we use the muller. Also notice how much darker the pigment becomes once it's saturated with oil. So now we're gonna actually start mulling the paint. So in the beginning it's gonna be quite tough, but the more we do it, the more malleable it will become.
Nusada, where do the pigments come from?
Great question. It depends on the type of the pigment. A lot of the pigments are they just come from the earth, such as the ochres and the ambers. So we get a great range of yellows and the reds and the browns just from the earth. Some pigments used nowadays are actually synthetically produced, so they're just synthesized in laboratories. And then, of course, there are some pigments that are made from animal byproduct, such as Ivory Black, for example.
Ivory?
Yeah.
From the elephant?
Another good question. Yes, the reason we still call it Ivory Black is because in the past it was made using charred elephant tusks.
Yeah.
Which sounds horrific. And of course people stopped doing that, and these days it's mostly made of charred bones of farm animals such as cows.
Wow.
Another pigment that has a pretty interesting history is one called mummy brown.
No.
Exactly. So, as you probably have heard, in the 18th and 19th century, people have been pretty obsessed with ancient Egypt and the mummies that were found everywhere. And it actually comes from this interesting connection between apothecaries and pigment makers of the past, that they quite often work together. And so people believe that ingesting mummy powder was a good medicine, and then someone decided to use it for the pigment. But a lot of the artists had no idea what they were using. They thought, just like us, that it was just a name. And famously, Pre-Raphaelite artist Edward Burne-Jones even gave a burial in his garden to his tube of mummy brown.
It's very interesting. Can I try it too?
Yes, of course. So let me just scrape this off. So the important part of the process is you want to move in circular motions, always scraping off the extra and putting it back on the slab.
Wow, this is so hard. Why do this?
Yeah, I agree. The process sometimes can be a bit tedious and long, but there are some advantages to it. First of all, it allows you to know exactly what goes into your paint so that you're sure that you're using the right pigment and no fillers, so that you're getting your money's worth. Then the budget-friendly side of it, depending on what pigment you're using, especially if it's an earth pigment like ochres, umbers, ivory black, or titanium white, it is actually very cost-effective, which is important for art students everywhere. And finally, you can also control the consistency of your paint. As you know, some people like it more runny and liquid, some people like it more stiff. So these are some of the plus sides to making your own paint. Okay, so now let's have a look at our paint here. So notice the drastic difference from what it looked like in the beginning of our process, how dry and stiff the paste was, and how shiny and runny it is now. So, to check the consistency of our paint, we can flatten it on the slab with the palette knife and see whether it's uniform or not. Yeah, so right now we can see that the texture is a little bit uneven. That suggests that the size of the particles is still quite different. That means that we need to do the mulling for a little bit longer.
Okay.
Great. So at this point we can also gather the paint in the middle of the slab to grind it one last time.
That's a lot of information for one tube, but I prefer to buy it.